Everyone, and thank you so much for joining us from all over the world for our event, Magnificent Design, Persian Influence in Textile Arts. My name is Sayadi. I'm a PhD candidate in linguistics and a teaching assistant in the Persian Studies program at Georgetown University. If at any time you'd like to pose a question, please use the Q&A box so that we may address that question during our designated Q&A portion. As always, questions are welcome in English, Finglish, and Farsi. Now I have the pleasure of introducing the founder and director of the Persian Studies program at Georgetown University, Professor Farima Mustafi.
خانم‌ها و آقایان سلام. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our attendees from around the world. On behalf of the Persian Studies program at Georgetown University, I would like to welcome you to Magnificent Design, Persian Influence in Textile Arts, which is a part of our Jolly News lecture series. We greatly appreciate your attendance today and your continued interest in our cultural events. I would like also to extend my gratitude to the Jolly News family who made these cultural events possible. I now have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, Dr. Carol Bier. Carol Bier is an art historian who has specialized in Persian art with a particular focus on textiles. For many years, she served as a curator at the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C. She is currently a research associate at the Textile Museum and a research scholar at the Center for Islamic Studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Dr. Bier will now introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Mustafi, and thank you for inviting us all to participate. The title of our panel today, Magnificent Design, the Influence of Persian Textiles, warrants consideration before we begin. What is a textile? It seems strange, but this is not self-evident. Several years ago at the Textile Museum, a group of us got together to try to determine just what a textile is. And after many hours of deliberation, we came up with the following definition: anything made of fibrous material fashioned by human hands. Think about that definition. Does it encompass all textiles everywhere? The problem is it also includes salad and nori seaweed. So we haven't yet arrived at a fully delimiting definition of a textile. So then what is a Persian textile? And what do we mean by Persian? As you will hear in our panel today, it is much broader than the geographic region that encompasses the Republic of Iran. Indeed, this is not only because of the vagaries of history and politics of the land Iran Zamin, but also the extent of the use of Persian language in Central Asia and India, as well as in the Ottoman Empire. And what can we say of magnificent design? To address this question, let us turn to the great influencers of their age, William Morris, a founder of the arts and crafts movement in the 19th century, and Owen Jones, his contemporary and architect. Jones is considered a founder of the field of design science. In 1856, he published The Grammar of Ornament and listed the characteristics that make for good design. Among them, balance, harmony, geometry, color, proportion, while Morris focused more on skill and the craft traditions, quality of materials, and craftsmanship. The aestheticism of the 19th century persisted well into the 20th century, promulgated here by Arthur Upham Pope as a symphony of pure form. He and his wife, Phyllis Ackerman, compiled the multi-volume survey of Persian art, which remains a useful but dated starting point for research. Scholarship has advanced substantially from the time of William Morris and Owen Jones, both strongly influenced by their perception of the beauty of Persian textiles and their formal considerations. Scholarship has advanced beyond Pope and Ackerman and even beyond my own research on Persian textiles published in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. 2 further notes, indeed caveats, before we begin. If you are wondering whether carpets are textiles, they most certainly are. And although historians think of primary sources as written materials for textile historians, it is the textiles themselves that are our primary sources, which may be augmented by the written word. It is my great privilege today to introduce to you our 3 young, vibrant scholars, panelists, each of whom is actively engaged in the study of Persian textiles from diverse perspectives, bringing us to ever higher levels of understanding and moving us towards a brighter future. Dr. Nazanin Hedayat Munroe is Director of Textile Technology and Assistant Professor in Business and Technology of Fashion at the City University of New York, New York City College of Technology in Brooklyn. She joins us from New York. Naz is a textile and fashion historian. Her doctoral thesis at the University of Bern, Switzerland, concerns Safavid silks in relation to Persian poetry. She holds an MFA in textiles from the Cranbrook Academy of Art and maintains a studio practice. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art, she worked in both the Islamic and education departments, conducting research, writing about textiles, and teaching studio courses. We may all look forward to her forthcoming book, Narrative Silks of the Safavid and Mughal Dynasties, Textiles Depicting Characters from Hansa Poetry. She is author of A Cultural History of Western Fashion from Haute Couture to Visual Couture, published earlier this year. Fuchsia Hart is a doctoral candidate at the Khalili Research Center, University of Oxford, specializing in the art and architecture of 19th century Iran. She joins us from the United Kingdom. Her doctoral thesis explores the patronage and use of shrines of Iraq and Iran under Fath Ali Shah, the second Qajar ruler who ruled from 1797 to 1834. Fuchsia's curatorial experience at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London included an audit of the VNA's Persian textile holdings and working on the exhibition Epic Iran. She also worked on the 19th century Egypt and Syria project, and she's written for Ajam Media Collective and Harvey Magazine. Her research focuses on historical uses of textiles with a special interest in gifting to shrines. Dr. Nader Sayadi currently is an Andrew Mellon Fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he joins us from New York. Nader studied architecture, historic preservation, and design. With a degree from the University of Texas, Austin, his dissertation considered the spatial physicality of Kashan's weaving workshops, Sharbafi, and local and global economies concerning silk and wool in the urban history of the late 18th and 19th centuries. His interests include technical and technological aspects of textile history and the built environment of manufacturing, commerce, trade, and mobility in early modern global economic history. Let us now turn to hear our illustrious panelists. I would like to begin by asking each of you to tell us of your connection to Persian textiles and what is it that drew you to this rich subject of study. You will each have 5 minutes, all too brief, I know, and you're invited to share your screen in turn. We'll proceed in the order of our introductions from Naz to Fuchsia to Nader. Naz, take it away and feel free to share your screen when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, for that lovely introduction and for putting everything in perspective so beautifully. In order for me to really talk about how I got into scholarship, I really have to start with my studio career, because this is where I became interested in Persian textiles. And I have to start just a little bit with my family background. My parents are immigrants from Iran. They came here in the time of the Shah in the late 60s. I was born in America. I've only been to Iran twice. And because of the revolution, we were kind of cut off from everything. And for me, those remnants of culture were embodied just in the things we had in the home, which were mostly textiles, as well as a few other things that we all encounter every day, like food, or more in a more specialized way in my family, things like poetry and music, which my father in particular was very fond of. So I grew up hearing a lot of poetry and a lot of poetry sung in music, but also working with textiles and living on the Persian rugs. So for me, this was Persian culture. And I also grew up going to a very artistic school. I went to the private school at Cranbrook and then later attended the Academy of Art. So I'm kind of a double alumni of that very special place, which was co-founded by an architect and a weaver in Michigan. So all things together, I learned how to weave. I started sewing my own clothes very young, and I became really interested in Persian clothing as a form of identity. And this started off with my art and design training. I started looking into things like color and form of garments, but I wanted to make them huge. Like I wanted you to be able to embody the garment instead of it wrapping you. I wanted, to go inside of it. So this is just one of my very early studies in color and form. But really, I think that the overarching theme of my work is embodied by this idea of a loss or a longing for a culture that isn't really available and probably doesn't exist anymore. And I found my way back to it through poetry, through Persian literature, and through literary characters. This is my MFA program at Cranbrook. And what I did was I read, various poems, particularly by Nezami, but also I was looking at Rumi and Hafez and the various poetic traditions associated with these ultimately Sufi poets. And I thought, I'm going to remake this lost garden. And so that's what this was. And I wrote poetry and I digitized the images that we saw in miniatures, such as this one, these beautiful paintings. And I thought, I'm going to make that huge and I'm going to remake that garden that doesn't exist anymore. And of course, the garden is gray because of the loss. And it was my attempt to bring color back to life and to bring the culture back. But of all the poets that I read, I think Nezami has affected me the most. And I'm really moved by his story of Leilamajnoon, as well as his other lovers, including Khosrow Shirin, who I'll talk about a little bit later on in the webinar. My introduction really to Sofavid Textiles was through Carol's 1987 exhibition catalog, Woven from the Soul, Spun from the Heart. It was some years later that I got a copy of that from my mentor at Cranbrook, Gerhard Nodell. And I realized that these literary characters were depicted in silks of the period. So I spent the next several years sort of off and on thinking about what that meant. And to me, when you have the image of a figure on your clothes, you're trying to become that person. You're trying to create a connection with that person, which meant that if you're wearing the image of Leili, maybe you become Leili, or if you're wearing the image of Majnoon, perhaps you're expressing your love for the absent or unattainable beloved, all of which are overarching themes in Sufism. So for me, finding culture and finding this, this link through dress and textiles was very important. In addition to making the garments and designing the patterns, I also engaged in some experiments with performative imagery because, of course, it's about storytelling. And so I wanted to tell my own story and my own version of these characters. So these are just some details of that. The text on the sleeves is Nizami's original Persian text. So this is Layli talking about Majnoon and Majnoon talking about Layli. In reading Rumi as a young college student, I also became interested in some of his references. He refers to the celestial beings as sabzpush, which means those adorned in green. So I thought this idea of your garments defining you as someone in the afterlife was really interesting. And in working with Hafez, I looked to the tradition of bibliomancy or Falgiri that we engage in pretty regularly for fun, but also in a pretty serious way in Persian culture. So I took a destiny reading out of Hafez's poetry book for 100 days, and I created this installation, and the garment has the word Sarnevisht, resist died on it. And then the viewers came in, and the viewers would ask a question and leave it for me, and then they would take a Fala Hafez or a destiny reading home with them. So there was this kind of participatory element there. And lastly, coming back to the idea of textiles and garments as identity and looking at iconography, one of my more recent explorations was to create this talismanic gown. The text on the dress is Rumi, and the garment design is based on one of the velvets at Rosenborg, which Carol also wrote about, which shows you how important scholarship is across disciplines, not just for art historians, but also for artists and also for historians of other things and for poets. So I'll stop there because I don't want to go over my time.
Thank you, Nazanin. I'll jump straight in to share my screen. Here we go. So when Carol first asked us to think about this prompt, I very much thought that my relationship with Persian textiles and carpets began during my time at the VNA. But actually, the more that I thought about it, I realized that, of course, it actually began during the time that I spent as a student in Iran during my undergraduate degree. And probably helps to explain a little bit my educational background. My undergraduate degree was in Persian studies, so I didn't start off in the art world. But I was fortunate to spend a good amount of time studying in Iran, and actually a real highlight of the time that I spent living in Tehran were days that I spent at the Iran handmade carpet exhibition. I'm sure that this is an event that some of you will be familiar with. It happens on a yearly basis, and actually just when I was sort of thinking about it again today, I realized that the 29th edition of it is starting in 2 weeks. So if any of you are in Iran or going to Iran, then I'd recommend a visit because it's absolutely vast. And I realize in hindsight that I learned a lot from just looking at all the different stalls, sitting with the dealers, and really just getting my eye in. And I think that this is something that I've been thinking about as I've been preparing for today, which is the way that we learn about carpets. Because the second stage of my education was an MPhil in Islamic art. And this was here in Oxford, and it's a very, very broad course. It's a very, very detailed course. A lot is crammed into 2 years. But within the field of Islamic art, still today really, carpets and textiles are largely ignored. And in these 2 years of studying what could be seen as a very comprehensive overview of so-called Islamic arts, textiles and carpets were completely ignored. You do come across them occasionally. I was having a think yesterday about some of the fundamental textbooks that we all cover when we study Islamic art. One of them is, of course, Grabar's The Mediation of Ornament. And in there you see one or two, you see one carpet, you see a token textile, but that's it really. This situation is improving in more recent textbooks that are used in the teaching of Islamic art. you will maybe see sort of one entry on carpets and textiles, but largely I think the field of study of Islamic art, and within that Persian or Iranian art, carpets and textiles have largely been neglected, and that's due to, maybe this is something that we can discuss further in the Q&A, due to really how the field was formed and the place of carpets and textiles, particularly within the market and connoisseurship as opposed to academia. So it really was when I went to the VNA that I started what I think was my real education on Persian carpets and textiles. And I was so fortunate, as Carol mentioned in her introduction, to undertake an audit of the VNA Iranian textile collection with Dr. Moya Carey, who was then the Iran curator at the VNA. And I think this is the way that a lot of us do learn. It has to be a very hands-on process, and often you do have a mentor who will discuss all of the techniques with you, the technologies with you. But I feel very fortunate to have really gone through a collection which is encyclopedic. That's really what the VNA textile collection was aiming to be. And as you can see from the examples I've got on the screen here, I mean, on the left, you've got the salting carpet, a complete piece, but actually what's really representative of the collection are fragments. And there are hundreds and hundreds of fragments of silk, from relatively large ones, such as this panel in the middle of back panel from a Safavid robe, coat of some sort. But we also have tiny, tiny swatches of all sorts of different patterns, producing a really encyclopedic account of Iranian textiles. So this is a brilliant resource, and I learned a lot from it. But I can't sort of talk about this collection without saying that it also makes you feel a bit queasy, the sheer scale of it, and also the sometimes what feels like quite painful butchering of textiles and carpets, which is something I'll come back to. Moving on from there, I was really fortunate to be sent off on assignment by Harvey Magazine to the Rietberg Museum in Zurich in 2019 to review a brilliant exhibition of Qajar textiles that was on display there. And that sort of took me further into the world of textiles, and I wrote for Harley a number of times. And one of the subjects that I really enjoyed working on the most, along with Turaj Jule, who's an independent carpet scholar based in Iran, is the topic of the carpets that were given to for the tomb of Shah Abbas II in the shrine of Fatima Masumeh in Qom, most of which are still in situ in Qom, but one of which is now in the VNA. So that's a bit of a crossover between the subject of the VNA and carpets and textiles in tombs, which is really the subject of my research at the moment. More broadly, as Carol mentioned, my research is on the major shrines of Iran and Iraq during the reign of Fath Ali Shah. In Iran, the two shrines I focus on most closely are the shrine of Imam Reza in Mashhad and his sister Fatima Masumeh in Qom. And really, I view these shrines as remarkable repositories for objects in all media. And my research really is at the moment very broad. It covers all sorts of objects, not only textiles, but as you can see from, this is one of the earliest photographs from inside the shrine in Mashhad, and you will see that there on top of the structure over the grave known as the zari, we have a textile on top of the zari, which is known as a zari push, a cover for the zari. And so what I will talk about more today are the remarkable collections of textiles and carpets which are still held in these shrines today. And I'm going to stop there because I think my time has already run out. I'm going to stop sharing so that Nader can take over.
Thank you so much, Carol, Fuchsia, and Nazanin. So I'm going to share my screen. Right. Yeah. So thank you so much for the question, Carol. And speaking of my relationship with textiles. I was born and raised in Iran, so I was naturally around modern and old Iranian textiles used by family and friends, even shown in the movies or TV shows in Iran. My professional involvement with textiles began when I decided to work on a group of weaving workshops known as Karkhane Sharbafi, or the Sharbafi workshops, in the city of Kashan in central Iran. In college, In college, I studied architecture and became a designer. Soon after, I got, let me see, do I have, let's share still, never mind. I studied architecture and became a designer. Soon after that, I got my master's in history preservation from Tehran University, where I studied the architecture of the Sharbafi workshops in the history district of Kashan. As part of my studies, I spent days interviewing senior master weavers or Osadan Sharbaf and documented the architecture of the workshops, as well as the looms and the silk weaving crafts. During this time, I also traveled in the Gilan region, which was a vital sericulture center in early modern Iran. Sericulture, or silk farming, is the cultivation of silkworms or nogan to produce raw silk or abrisham. In Gilan, I studied several aspects of raw silk production similar to their counterparts in the 19th century. For instance, silk farmers or nogandars still use the nursery or talambar structures to raise silkworms and produce silk cocoons. These talambars are almost identical to their 19th century counterparts. Another example shown here in this slide is silk reeling, or abrisham keshi, which is the process of soaking silk cocoons in hot water to unwind silk from cocoons and produce silk threads. The highly skilled craft of reeling silk in Gilan and Khorasan are also similar to their 19th century counterparts, particularly the role of women as the masters of this craft. When I came to the US to get my PhD in art history, I realized that I needed to learn more about the construction of textiles, their technicalities, the know-how of the weaving crafts, and the technology of looms. Where I started studying the technical aspects of looms and textiles more in depth by visiting textile collections in institutions such as the Textile Museum in DC and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, looking at fragments of fabrics under the microscope and discussing them with colleagues and mentors, among them Milton Sunday in Brooklyn and Manhattan, who I owe a lot. So I moved from the field and macro scale to the lab and the micro scale in this part of my career. I use these various methods to contextualize textiles historically and geographically. In my research, I've been particularly fascinated by two specific aspects of the history of textiles between the 16th and 19th centuries: production and consumption. In this sense, my work primarily focuses on the textiles produced or consumed in Iran in dialogue with the global market. I frequently face examples of garments worn in Iran made from both local and imported fabrics. For instance, it was common to make shirts and jackets from silks woven in either South Asia or Iran, while lining them with less expensive Russian printed cotton. Textiles were valuable commodities and easy to travel. They were frequently reused centuries later in other forms or new garments to create new fashion. In this sense, textiles have always fascinated me because of their not only the aesthetic qualities, but also their ability to show the past as a complex and hybrid phenomenon that doesn't necessarily fit in national, ethnic, or dynastic narratives with rigid boundaries. And I'm going to stop here and leave it to Carol, please.
Thank you all. Boy, that was absolutely fabulous. I'm sure that members of the audience, participants in our Zoom, are equally stunned as I am by just how many different ways there are to approach the study of Persian textiles. Our time is limited though, and so there's lots of omissions, but what I would like to do in the next segment of our program is ask each of you, again in turn and in the same order, more specific questions about your own scholarship on Persian textiles. And Naz, I wonder if you might begin with talking more about poetry and Persian textiles of the Safavid and Mughal periods. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I'm going to jump right in with that. So now I'm going to sort of put on my scholar hat and tell our viewers a little bit about what inspired me so much. The Sofavid period, if you're not familiar with the date, is primarily 16th and 17th century Iran. The sort of high period was primarily the 16th century. You may have heard of Shah Tahmasp, Shah Abbas in particular, who those are the longest reigning Shahs of the Sofavid period. And during those two reigns, during the period of time from about 1550 to 1650, we see this proliferation of these very beautiful silk textiles. Some of them are velvets, some of them are what we call voided velvets, like the one on the right that you see. And we see actual depictions from these narratives from the Khamsa, and there's also one example from the Shahnameh that I'll show you as well. But most of these right now are in fragmentary condition. We don't have a full existing garment of a Khamsa textile, although I would guess, if I had to, 99% that these were intended to be rendered as garments. And again, this idea of the iconography representing the wearer and also connecting with the viewer, who would then look at the person wearing this kind of textile and say, oh, I understand what they're saying about themselves. They sympathize with Majnun, or in the case of Khosrow, they consider themselves linked with this Sasanian king. So the story of Khosrow Shirin is about a Sasanian king and Armenian princess, and there's this kind of cyclical chase of the lovers. And this scene is the one that we see produced in textiles from this period. This is Khosrow wearing his emblematic Taj Safavi, which was this hat with the baton coming out, which was an emblem of the 12er Shia Safavid dynasty in this earlier period. And he's looking upon Shirin, who is traveling, and she has gone into the river to bathe and doesn't realize there's anyone around. So they just kind of meet each other by chance while she's in this kind of vulnerable position. And this is the scene of all the scenes we see illustrated in manuscripts. This is the scene that they picked to put on textiles, which is curious. So these are all issues that I debate in my book as to why this is the scene, and these various versions of this. But I'll show you quickly because I think it's a little bit sometimes hard for viewers to see what's going on in a textile. I did some drawings of the icons so you can see what's going on. And you can also see that although a lot of the elements of the paintings are reproduced in textiles, they're not exact replicas. We do see things like this leafy vegetation and Shirin's clothes and crown that are hanging in a tree. But the textile designers, or the Naqshband, which are the master textile designers, are doing something quite different here. We also see several renditions of the story of Leilamajnoon. Leila and Majnun were actually Arabs, they were not Iranians, but Nizami codified this legend of this young man who couldn't have his beloved and literally went insane. The word Majnun means possessed by jinn, or like a madman. And these two examples are signed by the Naqshband, which is very unusual in the Safavid period or at all for textiles to see a signature. So I think of these, having been trained in apparel design, I think of these as like designer textiles, because he's included his signature in Leili's palanquin, or the litter that she's riding on. And you can see his signature right here. On this side it's Kufik, and on this side it's rendered as Nasr, but either way it says Amal Qiyas. So we actually know who he was. He was a master weaver, and he owned his own weaving workshop, or Sharbaf Khaneh, in Yazd. And for a while he went to work for Shah Abbas in Qazvin. Now, as with any designer textile, there are also designer knockoffs. And so we also see versions of these stories. On the right, we see Shirin and her other admirer, Farhad. So they were sort of competing for her attention. And then in the middle and on the left, we see other renditions of Leilamajnoon. On the far left, we see Shirin and Khosrow in the bathing scene. We see Leili and Majnoon in the wilderness. And we see a third set of lovers, Yusuf and Zulekha, who were actually written about not by Nazami, but by a later poet, Abdul Rahman Jami, who was very famous as well, but much later than Nazami. So the curiosity here is that it's essentially the same scenes being reproduced, but in a different technique. So rather than producing them in Safavid velvet, or this compound technique often referred to as brocade, which we call lampas, these are rendered as double cloth. So not as time consuming, not as expensive, but still showing the same thing. But when you look closely at this group of Leilamajnoon textiles, you realize it's actually not depicting a scene from Nazami. It's depicting a scene from another Khamseh by a Turco-Indian poet who was 100 years later than Nazami. He worked for the Sultans of Delhi, and his name was Amir Khosrow Dehlavi. We usually just call him Amir Khosrow. But he was the first poet to write a response to Nazami's Khamseh. Khamseh just means 5, it means quintet, because Nazami has 5 stories. 2 of his love stories are reproduced in textiles. Amir Khosrow wrote about the same topics. He wrote in Persian, because by this time Persian has become the language of the elite and the language of high literature. And we call this Jawab Gui. We call this a literary response. So it is poetry in response to poetry. And the amazing thing here is that Persian language has carried the stories all the way to the Indian subcontinent. And it has retained its legitimacy as the language of fine poetry and literature. And so Amir Khosrow is writing in the same meter as Nazami, but he changes the story. He changes the story so that instead of always being apart, Leili and Majnoon have this one moment where they actually get together, and there's this union between the lover and his beloved. And this in turn is a reflection of this mystic idea of the human being who returns to the divine realm. So there's a literal love story, and there is also a metaphorical sort of love story between the human and divine. It's very profound and very beautiful. When we then realize that this story has been sort of transported through poetry and language to India, well, we also start to wonder, or at least I start to wonder, if maybe these textiles weren't also being produced in India for the later kings of the Mughal Empire, who are very Persian in many of their mannerisms. Persian culture is esteemed as the high culture. Persian language is used in the court. It's the language not only of literature, but of government and administration. And so we start to see this kind of crossing over of this sort of travel. So when we think about the influence of Persian textiles, we see the influence not only moving across a broad geographic area, but we see Persian language and Persian textiles coming together in a way in order to unify this whole broad geographic region. Figural textiles were disseminated in a couple of different ways outside of Iran. Thinking about the Safavid era and Shah Abbas was best known for centralizing the silk industry in Iran. It was, there were these sort of separate silk farming dynasties producing raw silk and separate workshops in various locations, including Kerman, Yazd, and then later Esfahan. And Shah Abbas brings all of these producers of silk and silk workers together under the central canopy of his government, mostly for economic reasons, but also as a way of capitalizing on this amazing commodity that Iran has. And he then starts to engage in trade with Europe as well as throughout the Islamic world. And one of the ways that he does this is by sending ambassadors, and he sends these embassies all across Europe and all across the Islamic world. And his ambassadors are always dressed in figural silks. Figural silks were very, very expensive. They were hard to come by. As far as we know, there were no sumptuary laws that would keep someone from wearing a figural silk if they were able to afford it. But at the same time, this was usually something granted to you by the sovereign, and it was a mark of approval. And when you accepted the gift from the sovereign, it was in turn a mark of allegiance. So on the left, curiously, we have an Englishman named Robert Shirley, who ended up going to Iran for commercial venture and stayed there for 30 years, married a Persian woman, learned the language very well, and was sent out as one of Shah Abbas's ambassadors. And this is Robert Shirley on the left in his khalat, which is the gift given from the ruler to him as a mark of approval. And on the right, we have an Iranian ambassador, Naqd Ali Beg. The two men were actually enemies, but that's another story. But he is also depicted in his fine figural silk khalat. In terms of sending embassies, these embassies would take many, many camel loads of gifts with them. I think the embassy to Venice in 1603, there was something like, 16 camel loads just of silk textiles. So just to give you an idea of the quantity of things that were produced, Shah Abbas was not only honoring the European heads, he was very strategic, and he had this idea of promoting both the woven silks as well as the raw silk by saying, look what we can make with this excellent quality silk. And the finest example of this, of course, was a figural textile, which he had made, as far as we know, specifically for the Venetian Doge. So this is actually a virgin and child scene. This is Mary holding baby Jesus, and this is one of the Magi bringing her a gift of cloth. It's a little hard to see the image, so I did a little drawing. And then the pattern repeat would have looked like this. This is a point repeat, which means that the images flip on the vertical axis. So they're mirroring each other in each row. Some of the other rarer things we see are silks that are rendered into garments. On the left, we have a Safavid coat, which is believed to have been sent as part of a diplomatic gift. Both of these are in Russia, one at the Armory Museum and one in the Hermitage. This one shows a scene from the Shahnameh. This is Hussein killing the dragon. It's called often referred to as the dragon slayer motif. And on the right, we have Majnoon in the wilderness with his animals. This was probably sent as cloth, and now it's been fashioned into a chasuble or liturgical garment. So very precious stuff. These are some details of those. So the one on the left is a lampus and the one on the right is a velvet. And I'll just wrap up quickly by saying how these textiles were made. They were made on a special loom called a draw loom, which by this time was also being used in Europe. On the left, you see an engraving from Diderot's Encyclopedia. And on the right, you see the type of draw loom used in Asia, both across Asia. And this is just a picture that I happened to take at an exhibition at the American Museum for Natural History. Okay, so I'll stop there because I don't want to go over time.
Thank you so much, Naz. Taking this a little bit further from issues of diplomacy, I wonder, Fuchsia, if you would explore in somewhat more depth your work on gifting and collecting and how important they are for the study of Persian textiles. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up quite nicely, I think, where Nazanin left off. If I can just share this. But I want to start with a bit of a provocation around the subject of gifting and collecting, which I will cover both in relation to the shrines and in relation to the VNA. But this sort of provocation comes from the Evening Standard, which for those of you who aren't Brits is a sort of free evening newspaper. And this quote comes from the review of Epic Iran, which was the recent Iran exhibition at the VNA. And the quote says that one of the things that you associate with Persia, besides cats, is carpets. And there's a particularly fine 16th century example here in the exhibition, formerly owned by the Duke of Buccleuch. It's actually still owned by the Duke of Buccleuch, but it was in the exhibition. And the author goes on to say, it probably fared better in England than it would back home, where it might have been worn to destruction. And I sort of want to take this off as a starting point because my reaction to this at the time, and I made my reaction known on Twitter, was that the author of this article has evidently not seen the carpet stores or the carpet museum of the shrine of Imam Reza in Mashhad, which has to be one of the finest, largest, highest quality collections of carpets pretty much dating from the Safavid era to the present day. It's got to be one of the finest collections in existence anywhere in the world. And thankfully, it's very recently in the past few years been redisplayed. A lot of this is thanks to the work of Dr. Harvey Magazine, who worked on the collection, and you can actually read more about his work there in Harvey Magazine. I can provide the exact reference for that. But this really shows that these shrines are often neglected or unrecognized repositories for objects of all kinds. And this is largely because these objects are often given as vakf in Persian, waqf in Arabic, or endowments. So they are religious, they are inalienable endowments, which are not supposed to leave the confines of the shrine. They do sometimes, that's sort of, that's another discussion. But so this includes not only carpets, but also textiles. And I want to start, what I should have done is started my timer. I want to start sort of in the Sofavid period because I want to pick up where Nazanin sort of left off. Of course, during the Sofavid period, there was widespread gifting, both within the country to, let's say, notables, but also diplomatic gifting outside of the country. But there was also great patronage of the major shrines of Iran, of course, during the Safavid period. And I think it's really in the Safavid period when the Safavid dynasty are trying to assert their religious authority, their religious credentials, obviously, as well, as they like to portray themselves as descendants of the imams. They really heavily patronized the shrines. And this is important for my work because what the Safavids did was they set a precedent, which was then really followed in the Qajar period, particularly during the reign of Fatali Shah. So what I'm showing you here are a few Safavid objects. I'll just briefly say that, and these are some of the most lavish objects which are in the shrine collection or have been in the shrine collection. I must say that obviously one of the challenges of working on these shrine collections is they're not always very easily accessible. A lot of the work I do is purely, it's very historical. I'm reading historical Qajar chronicles to find little hints of gifts being given. But it's also sort of archival in terms of looking for images. And I'll just tell you about one of them here. And again, this is good that Carol mentioned Pope and Ackerman's survey of Persian art, which really is still a fantastic resource. It's a fantastic resource for me, even though it is dated and not without its other problems, especially when it comes to textiles. But this object on the right is actually a section of the earliest existing tomb cover in the shrine, and it's dated to 1545 or 1546. And this object, I've already very briefly introduced you to the zari push, the textile that will go on top of the metal cage-like structure, which marks the burial place. But that metal cage is actually on top of what is known as the sanduq, which is what we'd sort of call a tomb chest that sits above the ground. And that would also be covered by a very fine textile. And this one here on the right is the earliest one that is still in existence in the shrine today. But Fatali Shah also gave a sanduq push, and I'm afraid I don't have lots of very good high-res images of it. So this is one of the best ones that I can show you. And he gave a sanduq push, but he also gave a new zari to the shrine in Mashhad. He gave a very lavish door to the zari. He also gave a number of lamps to be hung around the chamber of the shrine. So really this focus on the very nucleus, the most sacred part of the shrine, lent Fatali Shah what could be seen as a religious legitimacy, but also legitimacy in the eyes probably of the religious establishments that he was patronizing in Mashhad, which was increasingly important during his reign. But I also want to mention, and this is sort of now segueing into the VNA collection, because I'm also interested in the relationships between textiles and architecture and textiles and buildings, because this textile we've just seen will in some ways, as any objects do that come into contact with the zari and the shrine, this textile will then be imbued with a certain amount of what we could call barakat, or sort of a blessing. And these textiles are very well cared for still and treated with a certain amount of reverence because they have been in contact with the shrine. The next textile I want to show you is sort of in contact with a shrine in a very different sense. And this is a talismanic shirt, which is in the VNA collection. We're actually not quite sure where it was made. It may have been made in Iraq, but it's of a very similar style to pieces also made in Iran, but it was acquired in Iran. So it may have been purchased by a pilgrim, perhaps, on pilgrimage to one of the Iraqi shrines. So this is a shirt which will have been worn for protective reasons. And as you can see, it's absolutely covered in what we sort of call microscript. It's covered in inscriptions, but it also has two images of two shrines on it. On the right is a depiction of the shrine of the Prophet Muhammad, which is in Medina, and the shrine on the left is a depiction of the shrine of Imam Ali. As you can see, it's labeled Amir al-Mu'minin, which refers to Imam Ali. So what I'm interested in here is that the presence of the shrines, the images of the shrines, and actually these are sort of on the chest of the shirt. The images of the shrines are here giving the textile another sort of sacred energy that would protect the wearer. And to think a bit more about the VNA collection and gifting, royal gifting, I want to just move to talk a little bit about the gifts that were given to the VNA by Nasruddin Shah, who was the great-grandson of Fatali Shah and the fourth of the Qajar Shahs, because he gave in 1877 a very substantial gift to the VNA of 60 textiles and 14 carpets. And this was at a time when, of course, there was very much a culture of international exhibitions across the world globally. Iran was participating in international exhibitions. It had sent a number of objects to the very first international exhibition in 1851. But in 1877, Nasruddin Shah decided to send some of the finest examples of what he considers as the finest examples of textile manufacture in Iran at that time to the VNA. And this piece on the screen is an abba. It's a cloak that would be worn by a man. It's made of silk with some metallic threads in there as well. And you can read a bit more about this. This is actually on the cover of Moya Carey's book about the VNA collection, which is called Persian art. Carol, are you about to tell me that I need to hurry up? But okay, I'm really nearly there. It was always going to happen, wasn't it? But what I will also say is that one of the other major people who shaped the collection at the V&A was, of course, William Morris, who himself was a collector of Persian carpets. And here we can see a carpet, and a Persian carpet which was owned by William Morris, which is now in the V&A. On the left, you can see a picture of it once in his dining room. And I can't discuss all of this without mentioning the Archibald Carpet, which was acquired by the V&A on Morris's recommendation. And he described it, he talked about the beauty of the carpet, but something I find very interesting is he also talked about the intellectual qualities of the design. He thought that Persian design had the highest of intellectual characteristics as well as ones of beauty. But, and this is my final point, what we have to remember, and this is coming back to my very first provocation about collections and care for objects in collections. I think whenever we look at the Archibald Carpet, which is one of the most important carpets anywhere in the world now, we have to remember that it was actually put together from scraps taken from its pair, the second Archibald Carpet, which was butchered basically to make one very fine carpet which could be sold to the V&A, and a slightly lesser carpet which is still wonderful and is in Lakme. So that gives us some sort of food for thought on the ethics of gifting and collecting. And I'm going to stop and hand over to Nader.
Thank you so much, Fuchsia. Nader, take it away on the issues of production and consumption in local and global economies.
Thank you. So yeah, let me just jump in back. Sharing screen. So thank you so much. Again, I'm going to continue the conversation about textiles in the sense of, thinking about production and consumption, particularly. So for the purpose of this conversation, I would like to talk briefly about my current research project at the Met to address some of the points we mentioned earlier. Going back to my dissertation and connected to what's happening right now in my work, my dissertation on silk weaving in Kashan brought further questions regarding the consumption in fabrics and the change in fashion among the Iranian elite in the 18th and 19th centuries, mainly related to imported shawls from Kashmir. Iran already had strong social and economic connections with South Asia at least since the 16th and 17th centuries, when the Mughal royalty and courtiers admired and extensively wore Kashmir shawls. However, Kashmir shawls per se, these particular fabrics became substantially popular in Iran only in the second half of the 18th century. In the late 18th century, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a type of long sash called the duchella or duchelle that became an integral part of the elite attire in the Iranian plateau. The design of these shawls consisted on an empty main field, as you see in the picture in the middle, and large botte or paisley patterns at the two end borders. In these three paintings on the screen, the three women wear a Kashmiri duchella around the waist, slightly twisted and tied in front, with both long and falling to the knees or ankle, different heights. This fashion had roots in the Mughal court attire. Duchellas of similar design with white ground, as you see here in these paintings, were very popular in Iran at this time. Regardless, Iran was not the only primary export market for the Kashmiri shawls in this period. The so-called Kashmir fever began to rise in France In the late decade of the 18th century, when Napoleon's officers sent home these textiles, which they obtained during the French military campaign in Egypt. Unlike the Iranian fashion of wearing them around the waist, the French women wore them loose on the shoulders like a mantle, as you see on the right, the painting on the right, which these two paintings were actually painted almost pretty much like very at the same time, almost the same year, like decade or something. As a result, Kashmir mass-produced textiles of similar patterns but different use for Iranian and French consumption in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Unlike the French, both men and women wore these shawls in Iran in this time, in this particular fashion. And in this set of paintings on the screen, Dochella was with red grounds are depicted. There's no significant difference between how the two women on the left and the man on the right wearing the Dochella around the waist. While the Iranian and French taste for Kashmiri shawls overlapped from the 1719 to the 1810s, these markets took different directions in the 1820s. Fast forward to the mid-19th century, Kashmir produced very different shawls for these two markets. In France, large square shawls of complex designs became extremely popular. The French and later British textile industries also became interested in producing imitations of these shawls. As a result, or one of the results, the quote-unquote Kashmiri fever in Europe gradually disappeared by the third quarter of the 19th century. The Iranian fashion and taste for Kashmiri shawls also radically changed during this period. Instead of long Dochella shawls, the Iranian notables wore jackets or long overcoats made of a new type of shawls with rows of smaller repeating floral patterns. This old design strategy allowed the fabric to be cut and sewn into garments without obvious visual interruptions in the repeat pattern. The Qajar court widely used these fabrics to make robes of honor, or khalat, as Nazanin mentioned, in the second half of the 19th century. Subsequently, the bote or paisley as a primary pattern in this Kashmir shawl design symbolized high sociopolitical status. The Iranian interest in Kashmir shawls continued into the early 20th century, long after Kashmir lost its European markets. These shawls and their imitations from textile centers of Kerman and Yazd are also known as termen. To summarize, my study of Kashmir shawls aims to discuss the global Kashmir shawl history and its consumption in an understudied market like in an understudied market like Iran. And in a broader sense, I argue for agency of non-European markets in the mass production and mass consumption of textiles in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I really look forward to further discussions around these topics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nader, and thank you, the three of you, for sticking so closely to our time limits. I'd like to invite each of you to not share your screen, but show your faces so that we can have a more free-flowing discussion. And if in the audience you switch to gallery view from speaker view, you may be able to see us all at once. Boy, as you can see, this is a huge topic that could take us in so many directions. What we want to do in this third section of the program is just discuss one topic in a more free-flowing manner among the panelists. And the topics that we had agreed on were really technology, transmission, and influence. How does this happen? And what I'd like to do is depart a little bit from what our plans were and go directly to one of the questions from the audience. It's from a docent at the National Museum of Asian Art, here in Washington, or there in Washington, which is currently showing an exhibition of Safavid textiles from the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. It's at what used to be called the Freer and Sackler Galleries. She writes, we currently have an exhibition of Safavid textiles from the Doha Museum. The documentation asserts that a large number of silks were exported to Europe, especially during Abbasi's reign. If so, there should be some reference to uses of these textiles or images, including their use in Europe, somewhere online or in museum collections. I've searched for hours and can find only images of Persian clothes in European museums, but no references to the use of these textiles in Europe. This differs from Indian imports at the time, where you find lots of references, images, etc., of chintz, muslin, and other Indian imports. Please explain. So this brings us directly into that issue further of local and global economies. And part of it is addressed in the epilogue to my book on Persian velvets, where I argue that those diplomatic gifts, in fact, did not stimulate the economic intentions of the royal gifts from Shah Safi to the embassy from Gottorp at the time that are now in the Rosenborg collection. We can return to that, but I wonder if any of our panelists might address this question of just how many Safavid textiles, and we can extend it to the Qajar period, what production in Iran was transmitted to Europe other than as diplomatic gifts? Do we have information about that?
You know, Carol, I don't think we have tons of information about it. We have a number of European accounts, but I'm always curious about the sort of agenda of behind these first person accounts. You know, everyone has to answer to someone. If they were sent by the sovereign, they have to go back and give the sovereign the answer they want to hear. If they were sent on a commercial venture, then there's somebody funding that venture. So on the one hand, we do have plenty of accounts, but they don't all agree with each other. And it almost changes certainly every quarter of a century, but almost even within every 10 years. So the beginning of this was really when we look at the early time of Robert and Anthony Shirley, which I showed a picture of Shirley and his khalat. They were some of the first Englishmen to arrive on that, with that commercial venture in mind. They arrived in Qazvin in 1598, and this was about 5 years. No, it was 2 years before the East India Company was formed, and 5 years before Queen Elizabeth died. So they were quite early, even if just by a couple of years. It's almost like Silicon Valley, you got to rush to market and see who's going to get there first. But I think that these, particularly the figural silks, were curious for these Europeans. I think they bought raw silk, but I don't think that they were that interested in that kind of iconographic textile, because it really didn't mean anything to them, except that it was a representation of a very high level of skilled weaving. And they knew it was expensive because it was a silk velvet or a silk, what they called brocade, which is lampas woven. So that's my feeling. And do you guys want to chime in?
Fuchsia, do you want to go next? Or I can go.
Great.
All right. Yeah. I agree with Nazanin about, first of all, it's the information about the whole like in the text, like the textual sources and actual pieces of fabrics. It's a little bit fragmentary, so it's not that easy, I think, to say things by certain. In some parts we can. But there's something else I wanted to mention about this particular question, which is when we are thinking about the market or the markets, first of all, the production and consumption, when you think about it this way, so we have like these very luxurious fabrics that could be used by probably like 1% of the the society, the court, anywhere, and of course we have all the way down, so lesser quality. So first of all, it's important to think about a sort of an array of qualities at each time which was produced, and at some point it's important to think about a huge portion of this production was used in daily basis. Even like for a king, it's not always this super high quality, for instance, figural silks. In a daily basis, the king wants to go to bed, so but still he wants to have something like a silk or something very nice, but it's not as potentially as maybe it's not as luxurious as those super high-end ones. So first of all, it's important to think about the use of these, and textiles, of course, after a while, if they're used frequently, they just throw it away. So many things didn't survive, many fabrics didn't survive, so it's really difficult to talk about these objects particularly. And some of them were reused, so also like the context was changed. So first of all, that was one thing I wanted to mention about this particular conversation. And the other one, continuing what Nazanin was saying about these very high-end textiles from the Islamic lands, from Iran, for instance, the Safavid lampis or earlier ones. It was very common to see that, particularly in Europe, these would be collected, especially in this sort of holy context, for churches, for monasteries, for burial, and sometimes you see that some of them, like in the original context, it was meant to something else. Like for instance, I'm just giving a sort of example. It's not an actual example, but let's imagine there is a sort of what Nazanin was talking about, these Leilamajnoon figural textiles. It could be, as a sort of a love story and all the things that Nazanin mentioned, but it could travel to like a church, and that it could be used as a burial without the new context. They wouldn't necessarily understand, or even sometimes care about the actual original context. What is like, imagine this is like super luxurious, it's literal gold woven into the textile. They could understand at least those things. So you see like these things happen, and it's not just a textile. There are a lot of luxurious objects going back and forth between all these contexts and reused in different contexts. And about the taste, last point I wanted to mention is that sometimes you see that about the mass production, for instance, ceramics, let's say porcelain, Chinese porcelain, you see that these are actually literally different centers of production are producing for different markets. We have a lot of information about it, but sometimes it was just probably not working for textiles. So there was a huge interest in Europe, in Iran, for Chinese porcelain. Iranians during Safavid era, they started copying those for themselves, for the local market, would look like Chinese porcelain, and to re-export it to Europe and vice versa. So you have all these things. So sometimes it's kind of clicking in the sense of taste, and sometimes it doesn't. But it's really sometimes it's difficult to think why it doesn't.
Thank you. We are just about on time. We've allowed 10 to 15 minutes. We actually have 10 minutes remaining for questions from the audience. And I dare say we have far too many questions that we can actually address. One of them that I answered in the chat was about what is double cloth. Naz, do you want to go beyond my comment that it was a compound weave with more than one set, well, with two sets of warps?
Yes, absolutely. In simplest terms, when you weave a double cloth, you are literally weaving two sets of cloth at the same time instead of one. So you have to have at least two warps and two wefts in order to make even a simple double cloth. But they are not woven necessarily separately. You can weave them so that the two pieces of cloth on the top and the bottom never touch, so you could separate them at the end. You can weave them so they're connected on one selvage, so you would have a double width, or you can weave them the way those Leilamajnoon double cloths were woven, where you have solid areas of red and solid areas of white. And what this represents is a red warp and a red weft and a white warp and a white weft. So it's very hard to get solid areas of color if you don't have that additional fabric, because otherwise you're always seeing the crossing of the vertical and horizontal warp and weft elements in a piece of cloth. So when you have double cloth, you can create these kind of outlined areas. I hope that that's a reasonably straightforward answer.
That's excellent. We had several questions about fabrics and textiles that we didn't have time to address in this program, namely Gabet and Ghelim and Terme.
I answered a few of those actually, if they want to look at those. I wrote it out.
Oh, okay, great. And Shele, is that the same in Kashmir, Nader? Was Shele the word that you had used?
What was the word you're saying?
The participant has spelled it Chelllah. I'm not sure.
Chele. I think you're referring to warp.
Yeah, chele. Yeah, so chele is a Persian, a Farsi word for the warp, and it could be the thread, it could be the whole bunch of threads on the loom. So it could be like used in different ways. And the word which I used was dochelle, which means double warp, and it's mostly about the name of the that particular fabric, particular Kashmir shawl in Kashmir, rather than necessarily addressing if it's literally based on two sets of work, if it makes sense. Because usually these from a very technical point of view, almost all these Kashmir shawls that you're talking about, at least since I would say from the 17th century all the way to the 19th century, the main technical aspects are the same. They're tapestry woven on one if I'm not mistaken, on one set of warp, and it's called kanikari in the region. And kani are these small bobbins that they use by hand, and it's tapestry twill. So this is sort of, it continues, the technique continues, but they change, colors, patterns, and that kind of stuff. But the word dochelle is, I assume, is relevant in Farsi to the word chelle, which is warp.
Thank you. I know the organizers want to offer a final word, and I'd just like to reiterate that the extraordinary breadth of the subject can take us further in so many directions, as indicated by the questions that we didn't have time to address. Thank you all for joining us in our brief foray in this rich field of study. We have prepared a reading list, which can be made available at a later date when this program is placed on YouTube. And we hope that you've been inspired by our free-flowing conversation and our focused sections of conversation, and that you'll want to carry on your own research and further readings on Persian textiles and their beauty, significance, and broad influence. Thank you all. Negar, it's to you.
All right, thank you so much to our esteemed panelists, Fuchsia, Dr. Sayadi, and Dr. Munroe, and also our moderator, Dr. Carol Bier. On behalf of Professor Mostofi and the Persian Studies program, I want to thank everyone who joined us today and for your questions. Just for your information, this webinar has been recorded, and we will put this on the Persian Studies program website. خیلی ممنون. خدا نگهدار و روز خوبی داشته باشید.